I made 2 videos ranting about my least favorite games. I made a video gushing about my favorite game. If I overanalyze the whole rest of the series today, I'll never have to make another video again. Just remember, my opinions are all objective truth, so if you disagree with any part of this list, please know that I am right and you are wrong. It is a tragedy that the West will never get to experience peak. 20th. I already made an entire video covering why 20th is my favorite game of all time, and that video ran way longer than it should have because there was too much to gush about. It's just such an incredible package of everything you could ever ask for, crammed onto a single disc. 20 game modes, 24 character stories, challenge battles, chain tests, 2 different types of doubles modes, even a Wiimote waggle mode because, sure, why not? I wasn't able to cover the Wiimote mode in my video, but because I didn't cover it then, I have to mention now that yes, that is the thing that exists. Anyway, I don't need to spend another hour rambling here. Go watch that video if you want to see why this game is so magical. Chronicle. I know people have some mixed opinions on Chronicle, but I told you my opinions are objective truth, and I'm the one saying, Chronicle good. I think that turning story mode into a full-fledged JRPG is quite possibly the greatest innovation the puzzle genre has ever seen. A lot of people today will look at a game like Puyo Puyo and just see some simple and dated looking arcade game. But if you tell that same audience that this is a puzzle JRPG, you'll get their attention. Maybe I'm just a sucker for weird experimental genre mashups like this myself, but I do see this as a clever marketing strategy to help sell this game to modern audiences it's been struggling to reach. The reason puzzle games are dying is because the genre is in desperate need of a way to modernize itself beyond its arcade roots. They had to do something to make the game more approachable to new players. That's necessary in order for this game to grow. But anytime you hear the devs are trying to make a game more approachable, old players get antsy. No one wants to see them put one-button specials and auto combos ensue. So I think this was an excellent way to modernize by adding something fresh and new, but without sacrificing the core game modes. Everything the old school fans expect is intact, they didn't have to mess with my precious Sue. This game is able to offer something for everyone, old and new, and I think that is the best road forward. I really do think that if this game had ever been released here, it would have low-key been the best way to introduce the game to new players. I think the JRPG offers an environment that helps to reduce frustration for beginners who would otherwise stumble on the basics. Because even if you're struggling to get the hang of chaining, you can always fall back on the RPG elements to help you get you through it. And by the time you've gotten to the end, hopefully you will have learned at least a little. In fact, if you find yourself having to go back and grind it all, time spent grinding is time spent practicing. The point is to just have something that keeps new players' attention spans engaged long enough to stick with it until it clicks. It's just such a shame this game had the worst possible timing of being a 3DS exclusive at the very end of the system's lifespan. This was the point at which software sales for the handheld kinda just dropped off a cliff. Chronicle was far from the only 3DS game that bombed around this time. We know from interviews that they did consider localizing this game, but the timing very obviously wasn't right for it. I do believe that if the timing had been better, this game could have been the most important thing to ever happen to the series, because Chronicle represents a much needed effort to modernize the game. But I'm sure Sega will learn their lesson and never ever make another exclusive again, right? I do understand why people say this game is a little bit undercooked. There's more they could have done with it, but I still think that what it does bring to the table is great. The ideas behind this game are brilliant. It's a solid game that had the potential to be far greater. If I was put in charge of directing the next game, I would aim to iterate and expand on the concept, because there's a lot of potential for them to do even more with this. Hire me, Sega, I know what to do. Ultimately, Chronicle is the most creative experiment they've ever tried with the series, and I respect a game that tries far more than I respect games that don't. Because this is the last time Sega ever really tried. And when I get to the bottom of this list, we're going to talk about games that didn't try. But we've got plenty more to talk about before then, so let's talk about 15th. The blueprint for what will become 20th. There's not much reason to revisit this game now though, it's kind of obsolete. There are only 3 modes that don't reappear in 20th, and none of them are particularly interesting. They got dropped for a reason. This game still deserves to be up here for everything it introduced. It established the anniversary format. It was a good game for its time, I just don't have much more to say about it. The only real thing I can talk about is that they messed with Fever. It has a different set of Fever chains that just feel very janky to try to extend. So don't play Fever in this, it's a downgrade. Everything else is still good, but again, you might as well play 20th anyway, it's the same thing but better. I really had to think about this one, but I am going to put Box up here too, even though I don't think it's quite on the same level as the Anniversary Trilogy. In fact, the game's core gimmick, the Hyper Street Fighter 2 style mixing and matching, is kind of awful. It doesn't work because there's no good reason not to pick Yan. It's almost a straight upgrade over picking anything else. I'm not saying I expected this to be competitively balanced, Hyper SF2 wasn't either, but at least in that game it was an interesting novelty to explore all the old top tiers from before they got nerfed. Here, there's one clear top tier and no reason to pick anything else, there aren't any fun things to explore. But everything else in box? I do think this game deserves credit as a sort of predecessor to Anniversary. You could always choose to forego the mixed versus format and agree with your opponent to play each mode individually. Or even load up the full ports of 1 and 2 included on the disc. It even has Excavation in here as the first meme mode. It's also notable for being an attempt at revisiting Yan without being abysmally slow, which is... well, I'll talk about Yan later. If all that wasn't enough, Quest mode is the real meat of this package. It's Chronicle before Chronicle. Compile did the JRPG first. It is a lot more basic though. The only real mechanics are that you start with Puyo 1 rules, and equipment lets you unlock elements of Sue. Beyond that, it's mostly just your numbers go up, but so do theirs, so it balances out. Even so, from a flavor perspective, it's still just a fun way to reformat a story mode. Actually, flavor-wise, it's really good. Sadly, it's the only non-spin-off game that doesn't have a translation patch, but I recently replayed it with the controller in one hand and dictionary in the other. My Japanese is still just beginner level, but I was able to understand a fair amount of it. This is Compile at their silliest. They ran with the format to do a lot of visual humor you wouldn't get from the talking head cutscenes in other titles. I hope it gets a full patch someday. Now that it's the last untranslated game left, hopefully someone will tackle it soon. Overall, this big collection of goodies is a good package deal that was well ahead of its time, and based on how I've categorized these tiers, it doesn't make sense to put it anywhere else but here. Properly functional online play. Champions is the only game on modern platforms that is accurate to original Sue rules. The netcode doesn't lag, I can play against Japan at a stable 60 FPS. The quality of life upgrades are genuinely fantastic. The game just works, and that's ultimately what matters most to me. Not only does it work, the engine really does just feel a lot better to play than any other version, to the point where it's hard for me to go back to anything else. Really? I could even put this up here. I've said before, the only real problem I have with Champions is the fact that I get yelled at for trying to convince people to play it. Coming back to the game today has felt like a very different experience from where the game used to be at launch. If it's not peak hours in Japan, queue times can be pretty rough, and I'm sometimes just rematching 1 or 2 players over and over. I'll continue to carry a chip on my shoulder about the lack of major tournament representation. Why can't we have this game at majors when it's still the only modern release that's accurate to Sue? Perhaps I could say that 2018, 2019, Champions went up here, but in 2025, it pains me to have to bump Champions back down, simply because a multiplayer game is only as good as its player base. And that player base is... it's not dead yet, but it's slowly circling the drain. Champions is a great game, but I feel like the players were the ones who failed it in the end. There is a reason these are the only 2 game modes still played competitively. Sue, obviously. Sue is the greatest competitive puzzle game ever made. Elegant simplicity gives way to an incredible ceiling of competitive depth. The best part of Sue, in my mind, is the emphasis it places on actively paying attention to your opponent. The vast majority of puzzle games honestly do end up feeling like I'm playing adjacent to my opponent more than I'm playing directly against them, and I can give that a pass if the core loop is fun enough. I love this genre in all its shapes and forms. But Sue is special because it's the game that goes so far above and beyond that. True high-level play is all about real footsies and neutral, to the point where I always have to describe this game in terms of fighting game analogies. That said, the 1994 original isn't my favorite way to play Sue. I make a big fuss about Champions being the only accurate implementation of Sue's frame data on modern platforms, but I must confess I am slightly hypocritical about this, because there actually is one mechanical difference between the old and new engines. Compile-era games do not accept diagonal input, Sega games do. Being able to move laterally while soft-dropping technically does speed up the game slightly, but I see it as a quality of life change that I just cannot ever go back from. I can't live without it anymore or else I will misdrop. And really, is anyone out there actually going to argue against this change? In my mind, Champions is simply the canonical version of Sue now. Also, if you're playing the original in current year, You're probably playing single player by yourself, and that's rough. Later stages use 5 colors and high gravity to compensate for the fact that the AI is kind of terrible. That's obviously a product of its time. Nearly every multiplayer-centric game had to fudge the single-player experience in some way. They still do. Making AI that plays similarly to humans is a largely intractable problem. Even now, the modern core AI is definitely more challenging, but still very far removed from human play. This game was made to be played with other people, and unless you have a time machine to travel back to 1994, you're probably not doing so in Original Sue anymore. But of course, Sue is the greatest competitive puzzle game ever made, and it goes in the pantheon for creating that foundation, even if the 1994 version isn't the best way to play it. Fever! After Compile failed twice in ways I'll talk about later, Fever marked the first, and still to this day only, attempt at designing a game that both sets itself apart from Sue as a unique experience, and is actually a good game that can be enjoyed on its own merits. It doesn't dethrone the GOAT, but it doesn't have to. These games have managed to coexist. In fact, the most forward-thinking thing Sega did was include Sue as a bonus so that you get both game modes on one disc. One of these days I'd like to put together a deep dive on Fever Mode because there's so much I could say about this game that it probably deserves to be its own video. But I can't guarantee I'll ever get around to making that video. That'd be a big project I'd have to do proper editing for, and I'm making this video so that I don't have to do that, so I guess I'll give you the abridged version. I like to describe high-level Sue as a game of chicken. Both players are trying to avoid sending main chain first. The Fever gauge recontextualizes that game of footsies, because whoever sends first puts the opponent into Fever. But then there's another layer to that, because whoever goes into Fever first gives the opponent a better Fever later. I like that it's not immediately obvious when you should attack second, or when you should attack second. And Fever itself, I kind of just like the core loop of extending Fever chains. That part's just satisfying and fun. I really like how Fever chains are designed to be extendable. There's some very clever game design in how they all seem to have a few built-in ways to incorporate Big Puyos. Especially that one chain that seems intentionally set up as a hint to the player that they can pop this chain in a different way and see what happens. I want to shake the hand of whoever was responsible for that. I mentioned that 15th is a worse version of Fever. I think if you ever play that game, you'll come back with a deeper appreciation for how well thought out original Fever's design is. That said, there are also reasons why I have a complicated love-hate relationship with the game. If you ever watched me stream Ranked back in the day, you might have seen a little bit of salt sometimes. All I'm saying is, the game would be significantly improved if Carbuncle was straight up deleted. Actually, it'd be improved if all character-based asymmetry was removed. I don't think that's something that can ever be balanced in puzzle games, but that's a rant for another day. I consider Rulu mirrors to be the platonic ideal of Fever, and I'd be happy to only ever play mirrors until the end of time. Even in spite of a few issues, ultimately I do feel like Fever does bring a lot of good ideas to the table, and I'm sad that it's tragically underappreciated in the West. I'm like one of 3 people outside of Japan who queues for it ever. Fever's a cool game, y'all should play it. Japan still has a semi-active Fever scene, it's just not played very much over here. Though semi-active might be pushing it these days, it's gotten a lot harder for me to find games than it used to be when PPC was new. I wish we could get to a point where we have both Sue and Fever brackets running side by side, and they both get strong turnout. That would be the dream. But given that we can't even get people to play real Sue anymore, I don't suppose there's much hope for Fever either at this rate. And now for the games that are not bad, but just don't bring anything new to the table. Mina de Puyo Puyo. Also known as Puyo Pop, but they've used that name 3 different times, so to avoid confusion, I'm going to call it Mina. A slightly remixed Sue on the GBA. At first glance, this game's gimmick appears to be the story mode stage hazards, but little known trivia is that all these are reused from dip switch settings the arcade operator can enable in Sue, or accessed in the multiplayer menu on some home ports. Sega thought they could be sneaky passing this off as new, but don't be fooled. Looking back, it's kind of odd to me that this was the first thing Sega did after buying the rights to the series. I feel like it's such an uninspired game that it almost makes me wonder why they wanted the IP if this is what they were going to do with it. Of course, 2 years later, they did go on to do something much more revolutionary, but at the time, this game really was such a strange piece of filler to be their first game, isn't it? Fever 2. Fever 1 and 2 are literally the exact same game. I am unsure what the point of this sequel was. Like, Fever's good and all, I spent quite a while talking about how much I like Fever, but releasing the same game twice in a row is just such a silly thing to do, right? Boy howdy, I sure hope Sega never ever does anything like that again. And now we have to get to the games that are actually bad. Sun. I feel bad for Compile, because after achieving perfection on just their second try, they had no idea where to go next after Sue. And you know what? If I was Compile, I don't know where I would have gone either. The concept behind this game is that your reward for clearing garbage is to get hit by garbage anyway. Not only is the gimmick uninteresting and unengaging, the most tragic part is how little it actually matters. The idea behind it is that you're supposed to get a damage bonus for clearing Sun Puyos, but the damage they deal is negligible compared to just building a chain. You could say that because the gimmick is so irrelevant, it's not as bad to play as the other games I'm going to put in this tier, but still, why would I ever play a game that is 95% Sue and 5% slightly worse over just playing actual Sue? Yawn. If you know one thing about Yawn, you probably know about Void Hole. If you know two things about Yawn, you might know how unbearably slow it is. If you know a third thing about Yawn, maybe you know that both these problems are fixed in the GBC version and in box. So is Yawn actually good now? No. I put it down here for a reason. There are deeper underlying problems that I've never heard anyone else talk about, because Void Hole is where the conversation usually begins and ends. To explain why Yawn just doesn't work, I have to talk about a theory I've held regarding Compile's game design. I don't think Compile ever expected players to consistently make large chains. They definitely knew it was possible, but I don't think they expected anyone to get so good at it that double digits would become the meta. Puyo 1, well, I'll talk about that in a bit. Sue, it's a happy accident that the meta of large chains turned out to be the greatest competitive puzzle game ever made, but I have reason to believe that wasn't the game Compile thought they were making. Because if you look at the damage formula, I think there was no way we were meant to be dealing over 1,000 damage in a game where 72 is all you need to kill. Or if you look at BioN, 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 if they knew we were going to go past 7, way past 7, I'm sure that would have been different. And then on to Sun, like I said before, the reason Sun Puyos aren't useful is just because chains can deal far more damage. Large chains are what ended up nullifying the game's core gimmick. And now we get to Yawn. The problem with Yawn is that most supers do not work in a meta where players are building double-digit chains. In fact, many of them are actively detrimental. You'll just ruin whatever you are trying to build. But if you look at beginners who are trading 2, 3, 4 chains back and forth, you'll get to an endgame state where the board is very messy and has no real chain on it anymore, so at that point you activate your super as a Hail Mary to blow up your remaining debris and hope something good happens. That's what supers were trying to be. It's just that that's not the actual meta. The majority of supers that were intended for that purpose don't work when you need to build double-digit chains to compete with an opponent who is doing the same. They just don't logically fit into the way the game is really being played. Except, of course, for Void Hole. The real reason Void Hole is so broken is simply because everything else is terrible. But then you might be wondering, what about GBC and box? What happens once we restore the game to normal speed and remove Void Hole from the picture? I've heard a few people say that these versions are better, but I think that's only parroted by people who haven't actually played them. Because, believe it or not, they're actually worse. Some of the new supers that were introduced are true war crimes that make Void Hole look innocent by comparison. In original Yawn, supers only ever affect yourself, and that's why most of them are useless. But in GBC and box, there are several supers that can vandalize the opponent's board and completely ruin whatever chain they were trying to build. And there's no counterplay either. You can't offset a super, you can't prevent having one of your rows or columns just get deleted. Now your chain doesn't work, and it's unlikely you'll have any method of fixing it either. All you can do now is press triangle and make the opponent equally miserable. And so Compile succeeded in making supers that counter the meta of large chains. But this is a solution that is far worse than the original problem, because this new meta is completely unenjoyable. It's not fun to not be able to build. Yeah, at least these games aren't horrendously slow, and if you want to say it's better because of that, you know what, maybe that's fair actually. But only because the bar is so low, that still doesn't make these games good. Point is, every version of Yawn is bad, just in different ways. That said, for all of this game's problems, it certainly was an ambitious attempt, and I give Compile credit for trying. Sun just failed to meaningfully set itself apart from Sue. This game at least succeeded in being different. It just wasn't a good kind of different, sadly. I'd argue it was never going to work, because I do think asymmetry can never be balanced in puzzle games, but I say that with decades of hindsight. Compile was out here pioneering a genre that was still relatively new, and this is the process of throwing things at the wall to find out what sticks. I joke about how Compile died because they couldn't figure out how to top the greatest competitive puzzle game ever made, because really, what do they do next after Sue? This game was them trying to find a direction. It's just unfortunate that it didn't work out. 7. I give Compile a pass for their mistakes because the game was young and they didn't yet know what it would turn out to be. I can look at those games and understand what they were at least trying to do. But by 2009, I can't make excuses for Sega. I look at this game and I truly can't work out what they were even thinking. I don't understand what this game was supposed to be. Transformation is an absolute disaster of a game mode. If you squint at it from a distance, it vaguely looks like Fever, but it manages to screw up everything that made Fever good. The first cardinal sin is the lack of an active tray. While the opponent is on their other board, they are invincible and you cannot do anything to disrupt them, only sit and wait. In other words, they reinvented Void Hole. Because Mini Fever goes up by 2s and pops much faster than normal chains, attempting to extend chains is actually an inefficient use of time here, removing all the depth as the game is reduced back to basic color matching. Fever chains are fun because you extend them. Without extensions, they are no longer interesting. There is no room for skill expression, no skill ceiling whatsoever. Mega, I really dislike the timed combo mechanic. It's brain dead unga bunga mash the hard drop button. It also has no means of scaling up for an endgame. If you enter Mega multiple times in a round, it will be the same power level every time. Even though I liked Mega as a standalone meme mode and anniversary, it doesn't fit into what is trying to be a more serious competitive setting. And in having to pick between Mini or Mega, well, I actually don't know which one is top tier since no one wants to play this game enough to develop a meta, but they obviously can't be balanced. I would assume it's Mini because Mini scales and Mega doesn't, but I don't know and I don't care. I'm just going to say that asymmetry is bad for puzzle games and rest my case there. It's honestly horrifying how every single component of transformation manages to fail in different ways. There is not a single positive thing I can say about this mode. And truly, I do not understand what this game is even trying to be. I just can't figure out what Sega was going for when they designed this. This game isn't just bad, it's incoherent. 7's only saving grace is that it contains Sue and Fever. You can play the good games in here. Or at least you can play Sue. This unfortunately has the bad version of Fever for 15th. But you do still have Sue, so I could say the game isn't really any worse than the games in this tier. Technically, it really belongs here. But I'm putting 7 down here anyway because I wanted to dunk on just how bad Transformation is. It goes here for the bit. The Street Fighter 1 of puzzle games. I make this comparison for a reason. I have to respect this game for its historical importance. We wouldn't be here today without it. And I don't want to be too hard on Compile for not getting everything perfect on the first try. They just didn't know yet. On the contrary, I think it's incredible that they did get everything perfect on just the very next try after this. But objectively speaking, 1 has not aged well at all. The entire meta is just, first player to make a 5-chain wins. That's it. That's the entire game. If you build 6 or more, you actually lose because you wasted time and your opponent finished their 5 first. If you try to poke with anything less, that won't work either, because when your opponent knows they only need 5, they can build in such a way that maximizes their efficiency and consistency in getting the fastest 5 possible. You can't beat that with a rush, they'll always finish the 5. And so what this ultimately means is that there is no real form of interaction with the opponent. It's a speedrun race rather than a proper versus match. We don't talk about Street Fighter 1, and we don't talk about Puyo 1. If you've watched my previous videos, you'll know what the bottom of this list is going to be. If you haven't watched those videos, well, you've probably still figured it out through process of elimination. Directly responsible for everything wrong with the series today. I hate this game and everything it stands for. I think it is a severe step back from everything up here in the top tier. I think mixed versus is such a fundamentally terrible concept that it's even worse than everything down here. And I think it's the worst online experience I've ever dealt with in my life. I would sooner Violin! Myself than ever play ranked again. But as I want to make clear with the tier name, the deeper problem I have isn't just the game itself. is that I hold this game responsible for the direction the series has taken ever since. The paradox of PBT is that it is the most financially successful game in the series, by far, but it only succeeded in spite of Puyo Puyo rather than because of it. The majority of people who bought this game weren't here for Puyo Puyo, they just wanted to play Tetris. I think that PBT's biggest fumble is that it is not a good introduction for beginners. The vast majority of players who bought this game tried Puyo Puyo for a minute, decided it was too confusing, and went back to playing Tetris. That's what was always going to happen when you juxtapose this game next to something familiar that everyone already knows. They just played the familiar game instead. This game didn't make people want to play Puyo Puyo, it made them want to play Tetris. I know this because that's all Ranked ever was. Finding a Puyo Puyo player was rarer than finding a shiny Pokemon. And that's why Sega is stuck going around in circles now. Sega knows that the amount of money this game made is not an amount of money that Puyo Puyo can ever make by itself. I wouldn't hate this game so much if it had only been a one-off. I'd still put it down here because it is a bad game. It has serious problems that make it a step backwards from everything above it on this list. But I wouldn't care about one bad game any more than I care about the other flops at the bottom of this list. Like, Yawn sucked, and I'll analyze why it sucked for the sake of this video, but Yawn doesn't keep me up at night because we were able to move on from it. Its problems didn't continue to haunt the series for over a decade. There's an alternate timeline where after this game sells well, Sega sees that as an opportunity to localize a main game next, 30th or 8 or whatever you want to call it. The reason I'm so bitter and angry all the time is because that did not happen. I am angry because I do see this game as the direct cause of everything wrong with the series today. Literally the exact same game but buggier. Everything I hate about the first game is worse here. At least Fever 2 rehashed a good game, but this copy-paste is so much worse. Just the act of copy-pasting is offensive to me. There truly isn't anything new to justify this game's existence. What, a butchered version of Skill Battle that leaves out all the good parts of Skill Battle? The JRPG that was supposed to contextualize it? That's what they're charging $40 for? You know what the difference between this game and Chronicle is? Chronicle tried. This game didn't try. It is such a shameless cash grab. Sega knew that they could hit Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V, and you'll all buy it as long as there's Tetris in it. The worst part is, y'all did buy it. This is just Sega giving the people what they wanted, isn't it? I want to say that there was no reason Sega should have ever made this game, but I know damn well what the reason was. This game exists because Tetris is what makes money, even if it means throwing Puyo Puyo under the bus. This game exists because Sega knows that putting real effort into doing new things with the series won't be nearly as profitable as just hitting copy-paste. In the end, this game outsold everything I put in the top tier, and that's why we'll never see another game like those again. When I say that this game is everything wrong with the series today, I mean that the 5 years since this game released have just been this awful dark age that seemingly won't ever end. The worst thing that this game did was split the player base. This game isn't accurate to original Sue rules, it isn't acceptable for competitive play, and should never, ever, ever be used for tournaments. It isn't even a stable 60 FPS. They tried to patch a band-aid over the lag, but never truly fixed it. Like, holy hell, how can anyone make excuses for that? But try explaining that to people today. I bet most of you watching this video still aren't going to care. I get yelled at for trying to convince people to play Champions. I said that I'm frustrated with the slow decline of Champions. It's getting harder and harder to enjoy the game in its current state, and I blame PPT2 for taking my favorite game away from me. I blame PPT2 for the fact that I will never get to see Champions at a major offline tournament again. What really frustrates me is that it has been 5 years of this with no end in sight. That's why I say that this game is everything wrong with the series today. I've waited 5 years for the situation to change, for things to go back to normal again, but it's clearly never going to get better. I know it won't get better because the fact this game is made at all shows how little Sega cares. Not only has it not gotten better, somehow it just gets worse from here. Puzzle Pop. If a tree falls in the forest, and nobody's using the subscription service to hear it, does it make a sound? This game is so dead that Sega tried to fake the online with bots, and that is beyond tragic. It's tragic because it tells me that they knew this game would be dead, and they still took the exclusivity deal anyway. This is the only game that I have never played, and it's the game I never will play. Being exclusive to a subscription service means that there is a very real chance there will come a day when it gets delisted and no one can ever play it again. This has already happened to multiple Apple Arcade exclusives, including Sega's own Choo Choo Rocket universe. In fact, it's not even a matter of if, it's a matter of when, because someday Apple Arcade itself will eventually end service. And when it does, Puzzle Pop will become lost media. Imagine for a minute if this game had instead been released on all major platforms with crossplay. It would have gone... well, it would have gone here. Ideally, if it wasn't so laggy, in the best case scenario, perhaps it could have gone here. It can't go all the way up here. I will remain critical of the fact that there's still nothing new in this game. But at least we could have had this. We could have. But we didn't. We got a game that no one is playing, and what good is a new game if no one plays it? It goes all the way down here. Why did Sega agree to this exclusivity deal? Why did they repeat the same mistake that killed Chronicle? Why did they send this game to die, and knowingly so? The bots proved they knew what would happen, so why'd they do this? Because Sega doesn't care. Whatever check they got from Apple is more important to them than the long-term future of the game, more important than maintaining a healthy player base, more important than letting fans actually play the game they waited so long for. It's been 9 years since Chronicle, 9 years since the last time Sega ever tried, and this is what we have to show for it after all this time waiting. Sega doesn't care.